So the main focus of my teaching approach is to shift the focus from the instructor to the students. After all, it's all about the students, not about the teachers. So rather than teaching by telling, I teach by questioning. I ask a question, I give students time to think about that question, then they commit themselves to an answer by voting on that answer. And then I tell them, and this is the real innovation, in a sense, turn to a neighbor, find a neighbor who has a different answer, and try to convince your neighbor that you have the right answer. You have to imagine complete chaos in the classroom, 250 students all talking to each other. And then after about 2 minutes, I ask them to commit again to an answer. If they have not changed their mind, they can vote for that same answer again. If they have changed their mind, they can change it. And typically you see a much larger percentage of answers converging, or students converging on the desired answer. Why is that? It's because if you have two students sitting next to each other, the student who has the correct thinking is more likely to convince the other student than the other way around. But the key point is that that student is more likely to convince another student than the professor in front of the classroom, because he or she has only recently learned the subject, whereas the professor learned it such a long time ago, he or she has forgotten how difficult it can be to explain something to a beginning learner. Data has been incredibly important in my entire career. I would not be doing what I did was it not for data showing that I can do significantly better. For example, when I started teaching interactively, I had already taken data on my more traditional and highly praised approach to teaching. So I already had baseline data. After switching, I was able to show that I could triple the learning gains. If you measure the students on the first day of class and you measure them at the end of the semester, you can measure the gain. That gain tripled after switching to an active engagement technique. Using those data, I convinced others that they should try the approach. They tried the approach. They collected data in their disciplines and their academic settings. And by now, in thousands of articles about peer instruction, I think the method has been pretty much validated all across the globe in many disciplines, in many different educational settings. For many years, I've been focused on changing the approach to teaching. More recently, I've become aware that we should also focus on the approach to assessment, because it's the assessment that dictates how students are learning. And if we're not changing our approach to assessment, students will not change their approach to learning. In an ideal world, of course, students study for learning. Unfortunately, in the real world, students study to pass the test. And I think there's plenty of research to show that those two things are not the same. So I think it's crucially important not only to focus on our approaches to teaching, but it's equally important to change our approaches to assessment. So no more rote memorization or rote procedure solving. Let's make the exams open book. Let's give the students access to Google when they take the exam. After all, this is how they will operate in real life. When they work, they can look up any information they want. It's not about memorizing the information in the 21st century. It's about knowing how to use that information. So access to information, access to each other, collaboration, which is so important in the real world, should be incorporated into the assessment from day one. A lot of money is being invested in technology and education, but if you look at the impact technology has had so far on education, it's relatively limited. I think the technology's biggest role in education is as a source of information. In other words, later on, our students, the graduates from our schools, our universities, will have access to information like no other generation ever had. And therefore, it's important to have them use those sources of information from a very, very early age on, and not to have them duplicate the remembering of that information. There's no need for it anymore. So I think that the availability of the internet, of search engines, is going to have to change the nature of both our assessment and our approaches to teaching. So MOOCs, to me, are not really the very interesting part of education. I mean, there's a lot of hype about MOOCs, but look at the statistics, which are very disappointing, right? I mean, courses have hundreds of thousands of students, but they only start. And of those 100 and some thousand students, only a few thousand go through the entire course. And then you assess those few thousand students, and you don't really know whether they've learned anything, because the type of assessment that can be given at a distance is relatively limited. So even though there's all this hype, I think MOOCs are barely better than books. Because MOOCs, as much as books or lectures, basically focus on the transfer of information. And as we know, education is so much more. So I would not be surprised, and in fact it's already happening, if the focus of MOOCs is going to change dramatically. Right? It's as if, in a certain sense, the people who are doing the MOOCs right now are basically reenacting the standard approach to teaching, which is not very effective, and putting it online. Why would it be more effective? It's as if Hollywood would still be making movies by filming plays. They would be pretty boring. If you look at the very old movies done in the 1900s, 1910, 1920s, they were actually filming plays. But fortunately, people found out that filming plays is not the right thing to do. You need to film people in real settings. Likewise, I think online education is going to take that route too. The most eye-opening experience in my career happened about 7 years after starting to teach at Harvard. For those first 7 years, I lectured, and I thought I was the world's best physics teacher. Then, in my 7th or 8th year, I don't remember exactly, I read an article that talked about an assessment instrument that tests students' understanding of the concept of force, which is one of the most basic concepts in physics. And the article claimed that students who took introductory physics did not know more about force at the end of the course than they knew at the beginning. I thought that was completely impossible. And I thought there must be something wrong with the students that they tested for this article. And in order to show that my students were different, I decided to give it to my students. And what happened changed my life as an educator forever. As soon as the students started to answer those same questions, one student in my class raised her hand and she said, "Professor Mazur, how should I answer those questions? According to what you taught us, or according to the way I usually think about these things?" I went, wow, how can that be? Shouldn't those two things be the same? And it turned out that my students did not know more than they did when they came into my class. And yes, they could manipulate equations, they could solve problems, but they did not understand the underlying concept. That led me to search for better ways to teaching, and I've been on that quest for the past 22 years.